Another episode of Debt Nation. Today we have Satya. It's really cool because he's fighting for a dream of mine, which is lower taxes. I love it. Lower
Yep.
taxes. You are the lower taxes man. Everybody loves lower taxes. Why are lower taxes so important to Satya?
Well, what could possibly be bad about keeping more of your own money? At the end of the day, you work hard for it, and you're the person who knows best how to spend it on what means something to you. The idea of handing it over to this big government machine to spend it on all sorts of vanity projects, probably not such a great thing if you really think about it. I think most people probably do believe that as a society we should fund some kind of safety net for the people who need it. But we know that in practice, governments of all persuasions are very concerned about getting reelected and are keen to throw our money into vanity projects or into things like entitlements that they probably don't deserve, all sorts of things, foreign wars we don't want. And we think the best way to hold the bastards accountable is to lean them down, make sure they're spending it on things that we care about and make sure that we get to keep a little bit more of it, hopefully.
So now we know where you stand. Who are you? We know you're a Sky News regular. You're an entrepreneur. You're a writer. You work for the ATA. You're famous. You're all over the internet. You're an advocate. You're a speaker. Go on. Who are you and what do you do? And tell the audience everything about you. You lay it out. We know where you stand now.
Yeah. So I'm the policy director at the Australian Taxpayers Alliance. You got these lobbyists, working for, let's say, energy companies and so on. They go up to a politician and say, hey, look, we want a concession, we want a carve out, we want special treatment. And in return, we'll do, at the worst end, we'll give you some money for your campaign. At the better end, we'll create some jobs here or there. So they're able to do these things very effectively. But now, who is a lobbyist for the average person on the street? Who's a lobbyist for the taxpayer who just goes, works a 9-to-5 job, comes home, tries to support their family, doesn't want to see their money taken away and spent on bullshit. And that's where we come in. And that's, what I do is I write op-eds. So I frequently write for the Daily Telegraph. I've been published in the Financial Review, not just on tax policy, but also on civil liberties and things like that. One of our big campaigns was to legalize vaping with nicotine so that smokers have access to a safer way of satiating their cravings if they can't quit. Because, look, at the end of the day, we believe in freedom of all kinds, not just of the economic kind, but of the social kind too. Live and let live. And, the more control you have over your own destiny and your own life, the more empowered you are and the better world you can build for yourself. And, you can call me a dreamer, but I'm not the only one.
That's funny. You're using a little bit of the 1960s sort of hippie vibe there to push across your beverage. I like it. So you mentioned live and let live. This sort of Adam Smith was a big advocate of consumer, like educating the consumer, because a lot of socialists, or communists, and others, they push on this notion that it's up to the producer in order to control, dictate the good, in order for the good to be good, that the consumer then can obtain that good, not necessarily buy, but obtain that good, a good. Why is educating the consumer important in economics? Because I mean, isn't it up to the government to tell us what's good for us?
Look, unfortunately, when the government is out there dictating to us what's good and what's bad, they are often prone to special interests, the influence of special interests, or to us being swayed by what can hopefully get them elected. One of the best examples of this, or worst examples rather, in terms of how egregious it is the influence of lobbyists in the USA, especially the dairy lobby and the corn lobby and so on. So the dairy lobby, for example, very powerful, not just because of the money and the resources, but because so many electorates, are dominated by this dairy industry. So when you have that interest there, obviously they should have a voice at the table when it comes to policy, right? But for a long time, they managed to exert influence of the government and have milk basically declared a health food, to the Food and Drug Administration. And today we know that milk is actually not really a health food. You don't really need it to get your calcium intake. It's quite high in carbohydrates, for example. Even it's not just special interests involved. We know for a long time that the food pyramid even the one that our government in Australia, used to push or still pushes, will tell you that you need to have a diet that's 60 or 70% grains and has only a little bit of meat in it, and that's meant to be healthy. Well, that's bullshit. Higher protein, high fat, low carbohydrate diets, we are now finding out, are generally much better for people's health. So, you really can't truly trust the government. People need to be equipped with this understanding that, look, you should always question your information no matter where it comes from. And we think a better world is one where, rather than saying, look, it's hard to discern right from wrong, so let the government tell you, to say, look, it is hard to discern right from wrong. But let's educate consumers about doing their own research and about coming to their own conclusions based on rationality and reason. Because if they expect the government to tell them what to do, they will often be under the false impression that they should turn off that part of their brain and just go along with what they're told. And that is against their interests.
In the 90s and early 2000s, I remember America was definitely a milk superpower, for example, and they were overproducing milk, and yet Monsanto and others were producing Pontiac or whatever it was called, in order to double up that milk production. But there's a few different milk powers around the world. There's the United States, there's some European milk powers, Israel and New Zealand are predominantly in milk powers. But yeah, as you say, like that's very interesting. So do you consider this notion economically that consumers are at the heart of choice?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, if the government gets something wrong, then your only real mechanism is to re-elect a new government and hope they don't get it wrong. But when a human being learns from their own mistakes, when a human being is told, look, you should be cautious, you might get these things wrong, but here are ways you can research your own information and test the claims you're hearing, then it doesn't just benefit them in the moment because they make better decisions, but it really it empowers them going forward. It means that you have less cases going to court where they accuse someone of negligence for something which they should have known about. You have this problem right now in Australia, where people say, oh, look, the bank lent me a loan, for example, and it was a loan that I wasn't able to pay in the end, and therefore the banks are evil because they did that. And you look into it, and it often turns out that banks will only lend out high-risk loans when government policy encourages it often. That happened during the GFC. The American government was encouraging these banks to lend out loans in very high-risk situations in the name of promoting housing affordability. And that ended up backfiring massively. So if you can tell people, look, don't trust what the bank tells you at face value. Don't trust what the government tells you at face value. Even a news headline saying scientists discover X, actually read the article. And don't just read the article, read the study it links to, and actually see what's being discussed. And even then, often the person who wrote the study will have a conclusion that confirms a pre-existing view. But if you read the actual evidence he's discussing, often it doesn't necessarily support the conclusion. So a lot of scientific papers might even be compromised in this country. There was an article in the Sydney Morning Herald, in fact, on calls for a national science watchdog, because some 200 plus papers, taxpayer-funded research from public universities, are highly dubious, don't repeat themselves if they ran the experiment again. So really, people need to be vigilant. And when you're vigilant, when you're empowered to be vigilant, you also pass that on to your kids and your grandkids. You have a less gullible, more shrewd society. And if you live in a democracy where the strength of our democracy is our ability to make the right decision as a country, you need a more informed population that is empowered to make those decisions themselves.
Yeah, I like this notion that there's a disconnect between what you read on the news and what's in the actual study, because I'm finding that out more on this show. We have a lot of like transhumanists and scientists on here and technologists and others, and they're telling me what's going on in the news, and they're saying that the study doesn't conclude that. That's just the propaganda in the news because it sells. And and you're getting a divergence of what the society thinks because they're reading off the news and what the studies are actually saying, and the scientists and universities and other entities are realizing that they can rig the studies in order to tell the news what to say in order to get the funding that they want. So I like this notion. I'm glad the economics world is clued into this, because you are right at the center of the cogs of the economic world. So I'm very happy to hear that. Hey, who's your favorite economist?
For me personally, I'd say Milton Friedman.
Friedman?
Yeah, because he didn't just espouse ideas in theory. He was consulted by the Chilean government and by a bunch of other governments. I mean, I know, obviously, Augusto Pinochet was a dictator. He killed a whole bunch of political opponents. I mean, people like to make jokes about that, but it is still fucked up to kill people who are just because they're your political enemies. But he ran a pretty good ship economically compared to other countries at the time in South America. And in part, that was because of the influence of Milton Friedman and his ideas. I'm not sure if he qualifies as an economist, but I'm a fan of Lee Kuan Yew, the architect of Singapore. The Singapore model is, in terms of an economic model, is very strong. And recently we've seen the country in Africa that's probably, sub-Saharan Africa, that's been the most successful is Rwanda. It's the small little mountain country, which, had a genocide, like in the early 90s, where like nearly 500,000 people died in a single week. Horrific stuff. And today they're a powerhouse economy for their size because their leader, Paul Kagame, he basically adopted the Singapore model, or he's trying to move his country in that direction. They now manufacture stuff there. They make their own motorcycles, which is unheard of in Africa. So, I believe in learning from best practices around the world. And these are the sort of lessons that countries need to learn.
Let's talk more about Lee Kuan Yew, because he's an incredibly interesting figure. Because like when I went to Singapore, I looked at the buildings and I went, wow, this is. I haven't been to that many countries, but this is surely one of the best countries in the world. I looked at the architecture, I looked at the buildings. It's a very small space, and it was incredible. And he's liberalization, right? Built on the trade that's flowing through the area, built on the shipping network, free trade. But he has a strong state. I mean, they can't fit too many people in there. Talk more about Lee Kuan Yew.
Yeah, look, I'm not the expert on Lee Kuan Yew, but essentially he built a society where it's really based on what you bring to the table. It's one that encourages and rewards effort, but it still provides a great safety net. And a lot of that safety net is self-funded. So, people pay into their, compulsory savings accounts over the course of their lives. And if you end up being unemployed or you end up with a health issue, you have to dip into your own money before you can rely on government welfare or handouts. And it just emphasizes this. And so, by doing it that way, rather than creating all this reliance on the publicly funded pension system, you create this, you sort of maintain your savings culture. In Australia, we don't really have a savings culture. We're highly leveraged as an economy. A lot of household debt is extremely high, but a lot of Asian countries, people will spend very little of what they earn because they believe in saving in case things go wrong, saving for the future. And this is a misconception among some economists, especially of the Keynesian variety. They focus a lot on spending. They say if people aren't spending their money, then people aren't confident in the economy, things are looking bad. But keep in mind, a saving is just deferred spending. And often saving that money is a much better use of it, because that means that you're going to invest that money in something more productive. You're going to put it towards longer-term gratification rather than short-term gratification. I would much rather someone save up a bit of money and then invest in, let's say, Australian shares, for example, than just buy a consumer good from overseas or off eBay. We know which of those two is better for the economy as a whole. But also, what I like about Singapore as well, right, is that, to me, they exemplify the meaning of civic nationalism. They're a very multiracial society. They have 4 official languages, and they have a strong ethnic presence of people from India, people from Malaysia, people from China. But you are Singaporean. You have compulsory military service, which emphasizes that. Now, I don't believe we need that here, and it's not a libertarian idea at all. But it's just an example of the kind of thing where everyone is encouraged to, be a part of the team, and you should absolutely be proud of who you are and your heritage and where you come from. But you have more social cohesion amongst widely different groups because everyone is told, hey, we're Singaporean, there is a national interest, let's acknowledge it, and let's build a better country.
What is your official stance on government? You're not an anarchist. You believe that there should be a government, just that it should be very limited in size, right?
Yeah, I'm a. You call me a minarchist. I believe in achieving a smaller, leaner state incrementally over time. So I have a little bit of conservative influence, from the Edmund Burke side of things. I don't think radical change is ever a good thing, unless it's radical technological change. But even then, change is best when it's incremental and when it's cautious and when it's based on evidence. Just compare the American Revolution to the French Revolution. The American Revolution tried to build upon an existing society and culture and institutions, whereas the French Revolution said, let's tear everything down and just start off from scratch. And we know which one of those ended on a much better note, and a much less barbaric and murderous note. But look, I have friends who are anarchists, and even they, you talk to them for long enough, and they'll say, look, I'm an idealist. This is the world I want to see, but I don't think it's realistic in my lifetime. So my position is I'm open-minded, right? I could be convinced that we want a complete ANCAP society, but let's move slowly in that direction first and see if it's something that's viable, could actually exist and function well.
Well, because I got into the Bitcoin world and the crypto world so early, all of my friends, basically, they're not real anarchists, they're anarcho-capitalists. So they're all into the whole anarcho-capitalism. They're all building their own businesses, and which is basically holding functions and preaching anarchy. But the Jeff Berwick types, if you know Jeff Berwick, he just defriended me, actually. I don't know why. He just randomly defriended me. But it's probably because I retweeted some Trump thing. And
Possibly.
I think that's why. But yeah, so but anarcho-capitalists. So yeah, look, tariffs. Let's talk about tariffs because tariffs are they're a big news item. They're a big thing on the agenda. Tariffs. I know you can see the national security strategic side. You're not stupid, but are tariffs ever a good thing? Can you ever justify tariffs, or are tariffs always bad?
Look, this is where I probably diverge from some people on my side. I think in principle, tariffs are always bad. Ultimately, they're borne by your own domestic consumers and by your own domestic businesses who are less able to access things from outside the country, which they could use to produce things more efficiently and effectively. So as a principle, yes, tariffs are all bad. However, and this is where I diverge from people. In a world like ours, where the only way to achieve free trade is by horse trading with another country, by negotiating them down and trying to get them to give you concessions in exchange for you giving them concessions, in a situation where you give complete access to your own domestic market, but then the other country isn't giving you access to theirs. In these sorts of situations, you unfortunately aren't dealing with you don't actually have free trade at all. You just have a one-sided trade agreement that it has all these carve-outs that many of which aren't in your interest. And I think as a temporary measure of exerting pressure on another country, tariffs could be temporarily justified as a way to sort of coerce them into giving you more access, but only as a temporary measure. People have asked me, what do you think of Trump's tariffs against China and so on? And I've said two things. Firstly, well, look, I don't like tariffs on principle, and I think this might end very badly. However, my final judgment I'll reserve for what the ultimate outcome is. If this ends with China just folding and saying, hey, we're going to make it a lot easier for American companies to enter our market now, we're going to stop stealing IP from US firms, and we're going to stop putting our own tariffs so highly on American goods. If that's the ultimate outcome, then I'm a pragmatist. I'll say, yep, that tariff was justified at the time because it achieved the outcome we want. But a tariff that doesn't result in that outcome, but just results in more tariffs, is very bad.
What was the original one? Was the smoothie something bill, right? The smoothie something, and that led, that was out of the Great Depression, or it led to the Great Depression, the Smoody something tariff bill. Anyway, that was a Great Depression tariff bill led by a congressman who basically, fumbled the ball on that one, and that's the bad example of a tariff where it led to just more tariffs, incurring tariffs. But I think like Trump, for example, he's playing around with tariffs. I think he knows that the costs are burden on the American people. I think he doesn't care. I don't think he cares. I think it's like he understands the impact, and he says, all right, and he knows that Americans are going to pay more, but he doesn't care, right? So like, a lot of people say, because I talk to these free marketers all the time. They say, well, he doesn't know that, but I think he knows that. I think he cares, and I think it's like more in line with these goals of national security, IP theft, and other things. And in a short measure, I think that's fine. I think that's absolutely justified. Do you agree? So you agree with that?
Yeah, as a short-term measure. But my concern is always, look, governments will often justify things they do based on fairly valid premise, but the ultimate outcome isn't that. This is a very common trend. I think the best example is all these taxes that came in during the world wars that were meant to fund the war effort. They were meant to be temporary. I believe that's how the income taxes came into this country. It's certainly how the income tax came into the USA, I believe. And then guess what? The war is over, and suddenly no one's talking about repealing these taxes. So they're brought in on this premise, and people go, oh yeah, as a temporary measure, I can understand. Literally the exact argument I just gave you, 10 minutes ago, 5 minutes ago. And next minute, the government isn't getting rid of them. So that is a concern. I know in a lot of African countries, they impose very high tariffs on goods and services coming in from their own neighbors. Because a lot of the government's revenue, because they can't collect any tax from people because they don't have the infrastructure to collect all that tax. So there's a massive black economy everywhere. So what does the government do for revenue? Well, they just put a massive tariff on goods coming in, and you can educate them about the benefits of free trade, but you got a dictator sitting there and he's just going, "What? I make less money? I don't want to do that,"
Let's switch gears because we're running out of time. So, are banks? Is it moral for banks to make a profit?
Well, of course, any business businesses should always be run for the profit of their shareholders. That's why they exist. Otherwise, they're letting the owners of the business down. Banks absolutely should be run for a profit, and we want a competitive, strong financial sector where banks who fleece people, you always have the choice of moving to a different bank and getting a better deal. But when you have heavy regulatory barriers of entry, and you have less competition, that is when you end up in a situation where there's less choice as a consumer. And those are situations, where there's too much regulation often, where you have banks allegedly ripping people off. But a bank absolutely should make a profit like any other business. They're not special.
So we had Anthony Reynolds on, and he said he's a banking expert. You've spoken with him at Liberty Fest. You've both been on the stage and all that. And he said that in Australia, the banks are an oligopoly, the big four. What do you say? Do you think that the big four are an oligopoly?
Oh, absolutely. And one of the problems is that every time you have a royal commission or something, the banks are the ones who end up, being able to deal with that situation very well. They're the ones who often write the regulations beforehand and go to the government and say, hey, by the way, we've already imposed sanctions on ourselves. Look at this. And often those regulations do actually impose some sanctions, but they're also designed to entrench the market share of the existing players. The banks are also very good at finding scapegoats. So one of the findings of the Royal Commission, for example, was that the banks were able to blame mortgage brokers for a lot of home loans being put out that probably shouldn't have been put out. And the mortgage brokers got blamed, and one of the recommendations was to change the profit model for mortgage brokers that would effectively put 70% of them out of work. And of course, that never went ahead because the mortgage broking industry fought back. But that just goes to show you, at the end of the day, you have these powerful, strong financial institutions with a lot of influence. And, rather than focusing on having more and more regulation in place, which actually is counterproductive, we should empower consumers to understand, look, don't go out there and get a home loan just because the bank teller, or just because the guy you spoke to at the bank told you should do this. Don't just go ahead with it because your broker told you this. Use your own brain because you really shouldn't be complaining when you should know better.
The Soviet Union used to be a powerhouse, but it adopted communism and it went flat and it couldn't maintain itself as a superpower. Now it's Russia and it's just spewing out one commodity, which is oil. Australia is a powerhouse. It used to be more less free market. It's more free market now. We're spewing out a couple, which is basically education, iron ore, and coal. What do you see? Is Australia's economic foundation strong? Where are we going into the future? Are we looking strong? I mean, we're in a good geographic region, like in Asia. There's a lot of consumers and a lot of people and money around us. What do you see for the future of Australia's economy?
Things looking pretty good right now. However, we've also done extremely well off generally favorable global headwinds in the last few years, which have allowed our government, for example, to make a lot more revenue in terms of GST and so on. We have a very strong service sector and well-educated population, especially in the East. That's why Sydney and Melbourne are going to keep growing. And a lot of that growth is, of course, immigration. We've had 3 per capita recessions in the last 28 years, but we've had no recessions if you just go by the headline GDP figure. So the immigration numbers are actually propping a lot of that up, certainly. And of course, when you have strong export like our university education, I mean, let's be frank here. A lot of the incentive of people to study here is the chance to immigrate here. So many international students apply for visas and try to get jobs and want to be a part of the Australian story, and why not? More power to them. But there is a tie-in over there as well. Look, I think there's probably a lot more that we could do to take advantage of our position, because our position is not going to last. That happens in any situation where you're relying on globally favorable headwinds. Now is the time for structural reform, to move towards slightly flatter taxes, for example. I mean, just maintain the progressive system, but have fewer tax brackets so you create more reward for rising up, over the course of your career, getting promotions, working harder, and so on. Create more incentives to save and invest, and also remove red tape and regulation, because that's the easiest and the best way to stimulate your economy. Is to remove some of these sunk costs for businesses, to comply with a long list of regulations, and then you also reducing the amount of government bureaucracy needed, which you have to pay for. Of course, taxes pay for that, to ensure compliance. So let's move towards smarter, leaner, regulations. Let's make the most of our natural resources. A lot of our shale gas, for example, our natural gas, is locked away because of fracking bans, which are only now beginning to lift up slowly. I think there's a lot more we can do there. The other thing that I think we need to really change is, look, we're resource rich, but we have some of the world's most expensive electricity, right? So it's absolutely criminal that that's the case. And it's because governments have had so many failed policies in this area. And I believe that by liberalizing our resource extraction, and by moving towards, most smarter regulations in the electricity sector that could lower prices down, the way America has done the same thing, we could potentially maybe even reindustrialize the country. We could see some manufacturing come back, because America still has a manufacturing sector. I mean, it's not great, but it's there. And I think we've really shot ourselves in the foot with some of these policies in electricity, especially. So I think that's what I'd change.
So are you on board with coal and nuclear, or just coal?
I'm on board with any energy source, even wind and solar, but let's have competition. Let's not have policies that artificially favor one source over the other. People come out here saying wind and solar are the best, they're so cheap. All right, well, let them compete. Stop subsidizing them with my money. If they really are cheap, you wouldn't need to take my money and throw them at as corporate welfare in these companies. I'm certainly pro-nuclear. I believe we need to lift the moratorium up. I think it's unfortunate that we didn't do that 20 years ago, because now it takes a long time to set nuclear up. And the longer you wait, the less profitable it is. I think, within 50 years, I'm hoping that not only will the ban be up, but we'll see plants coming into this country. Or the rest of the world is innovating. We're being left behind. But hey, at this rate, we would at least take advantage of what they discover, what they come up with.
In the last minute, quickly, a lot of people argue and say, but the housing market. Quickly go on about the housing market and what's going on with the housing market. Is that a problem for the Australian economy?
Look, we have one of the most heavily leveraged housing markets in the world. The Reserve Bank is cutting interest rates and flooding the market with even more easy credit. On top of that, the government came up with this idea, which for this stupid scheme, which I'll very happily take advantage of, by the way, but it is a stupid idea, where they will cover 15% of your deposit for a home, so people can to help more people get into the housing market. So that's the taxpayer basically underwriting private risk. It's basically nationalizing the bank of mom and dad in a sense. And this is all quite concerning, right? Because if we live in so much debt that if the housing market crashes, that is a massive loss of not simply the value of your asset, but of your family legacy. So much family wealth is locked away in the housing market. So many people have pulled themselves, from the working class into the middle class because they invested in real estate. And I think that creates incentives for the government to try and ensure that the tents are still propped up, so to speak, right? Like there's a reason why the government isn't going out of their way to rezone all this land to free up a housing supply. And it's obvious why. They don't want to crash the prices. Yeah, sure, it'll create more affordable housing, but it'll mean that the people who currently own property will see their legacy or their assets devalued. So it is a really precarious situation. And it also creates pressure to rely more and more on immigration to ensure that the demand stays up, to keep the prices up. So it is a tough situation. How do you untangle this mess at this stage? Are we locked in this way for good? I think the only solution is to be a bit more like America, who have all these small cities dotting their country. You don't have to live and work in New York or LA, which are expensive places. You can live and work in Columbus, Ohio. You can go to New Orleans, Louisiana, for example. I think we need to really develop our smaller cities and our regions. And by lifting some of the regulations that are holding back these places is, I think, a good step in the right direction.
Fantastic. So we've run out of time, but just have your final say. Plug your ATA or whatever you want to do.
Sure. Visit us at taxpayers.org.au. You can sign up for updates on our campaigns that interest you. Like us on Facebook, Australian Taxpayers Alliance. Follow us on Twitter. And check out our podcast. It's called ATA-Pod, ATA_pod. That's on Spotify. It's some great content. We interview some amazing experts across politics and across different fields. So
I want to bring Emilio on. This show is called Debt Nation because debt is fundamental to all of these topics and conversations. Thank you very much for coming on Debt Nation. I mean, I've had a lot of fun, and I can't wait till we come on again and talk about all these other things to do with damn taxes.
Sure, man. Thanks so much. Take care. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you very much.